All right, everybody. Hello and welcome into KBO Chats Live. I'm Sam Pasco alongside Erik Halterman, and we are breaking down each and every KBO game on the slate today, whether it be for DFS or betting. This is where you need to be for all your info. It is the first show of the season, so we are going to spend a little time on the off-season recap and a little DFS 101, a little primer. Before we dive into it, I do want to mention that it is rotowire.com/free KBO. Check that out for a free trial subscription. We are on Twitch. We are on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and like. It does help us out. Without any further ado, let's dive right into it. Erik, we are looking at the Eagles, starting with the bottom team. Tell me, how did the KBO's worst team do this offseason?
They didn't do a lot, although I guess trading out some of their foreign players who didn't work out very well for new ones might do something. They lost also their leadoff man, Jung Lee, in free agency, who was one of the only hitters from their team that I ever recommended for DFS. So not a lot of moves that are going to suddenly send them charging up the standings. I mean, even if Ryan Healy sets the KBO home run record, I don't think that's going to be enough to make them a true contender. Nick Kingham we saw last year, for 2 starts before he got injured. No reason to get particularly excited there. Ryan Carpenter, a guy who last pitched in Taiwan, did have a good debut last night, but not nearly enough to overcome a massive gap between them and the final playoff spot.
For sure, Ryan Healy, too, 4 strikeouts in his 8 at-bats so far, so nothing crazy right now. Do want to welcome in some of our longtime viewers here. Barry, great to see you come in, and we got some other guys joining us as well. We're talking about the offseason recap right now. So Eagles, nothing crazy right now. Moving into the 9th team, the SK Wyverns, or shall I say the SSG Landers. They have a new name. Caused a little issue in our back-end system, but they are now the Landers. How did they do this past offseason, losing Tyler Wright, and maybe even a addition by subtraction with losing Ricardo Pinto?
Yeah, I actually think they had the best offseason of any team in the league in everything except for from a branding perspective. I think Wyverns clearly was a top-tier name. Landers, I mean, that's okay. Maybe got some cool UFO stuff, but come on, the Wyverns, you're giving that up. And they're going from a W on the hat to an L is not a good sign. But it was a good offseason on the whole. They really did not have any help from their foreign players outside of Jamie Romack last year. We talked about Kingham already. He got injured very early in the season. They brought in Tyler White, and I think he played 9 games before getting hurt himself. And Ricardo Pinto, one of the worst starters in the league, foreign or domestic. So just getting 2 new foreign arms is a big help all by itself. Then they actually got an extra former MLB player in Shin-Soo Choo, who, of course, isn't a foreign player because he's Korean, even though he's never played in KBO. He came straight to affiliated ball in America, I think, as a teenager. And they also made one of the better free agent signings in Ji-Won Choi, the second baseman, who was a big part of the Bears dynasty. So they got enough new pieces in that lineup with Choo and Choi to help Jung Che and Romack in the heart of that lineup. And, the foreign pitchers can't be any worse than what they had last year. So, again, this was a team that was quite good for a long time before dropping all the way to 9th last year. So I think not at all out of the question that they're in the mix for the final playoff spot this season.
For sure, Pinto with an ERA over 6 last season. And Ji-Won Choi, that is an interesting move. He had 16 home runs last season, now has 3 through his first 2 games. So definitely could provide some power in that lineup. Moving on now to the Samsung Lions. They finished 8th last season. Big move here, Jayhawk Lee going from the Bears to the Lions here. He's hurt right now, but when he comes back, I imagine this will be an impactful move. What are our thoughts here?
Yeah, that's definitely something. Again, not a lot of free agent movement in the KBO in general. Guys seem to stick with one team for much more often than they do in MLB. So I think O is one of the biggest signings there. Won't help them yet. They're also, I think, the only team who held on to both of their foreign starters, David Buchanan and Ben Lively, and they're both pretty good. So nothing lost there by keeping those guys. But I think they were a pretty big gap away from the back of the playoffs, and they didn't make the same kind of jump that the Landers did in the offseason. So I would see them as definitely an underdog to push for a wild card spot.
So nothing too impressive there. Moving now to the number 7 team from last year, the Lotte Giants. They, of course, have the ace Dan Straley, but his co-partner in foreign import, Adrian Sampson, did leave in free agency. Anderson Franco replaced him. 3 runs in his 5-inning debut. Nothing crazy, but he did beat the Dinos, the defending champs, if that means anything to you. Anything on a quiet Giants offseason here?
Yeah, they probably needed more than this to become a favorite to win a wild card spot. A lot of their fortunes are going to rest on Dan Straley being amazing again and just getting enough from other guys. That was almost enough last year. They didn't finish too far out. But unless Anderson Franco is way better than his resume suggests, I think he's one of the least experienced foreign starters in the KBO, barely any innings at the MLB level at all. So unless they uncovered a hidden gem there, I'm not sure they did a whole lot to make them all that exciting.
Yeah, only 6 major league innings for Franco, and now joining the Lotte Giants. Moving on to the Kia Tigers in the 6th spot. They were competitive all throughout last year, but they are losing Hyun Yang. If you told me that they lost him maybe in 2019, that would be something. When he had an ERA under 2.5. Last year was more of a meh pitcher, ERA over 4.5. What are we thinking here with the Tigers and their changing pitching rotation here?
Yeah, it's another team who probably needed to do more than they did. Drew Gagnon was pretty good at times last year, didn't end up with great numbers. I think Daniel Mengden has one of the stronger resumes of the foreign pitchers in the KBO this season, so that could be a nice addition. I think him and Aaron Brooks could be quite good at the top of their rotation, But Yang, even though he had a down year, he was still one of the best domestic starters in the league. Losing him is a blow, and they didn't really add enough. They were not far out of the playoffs last year, but I don't think they necessarily got any better here.
Yes, Barry here noting that Brooks returning was pretty big. He had some major league offers, I would imagine, but he is returning to the Kia Tigers. Moving right along, we have the Kiwoom Heroes team that actually made the playoffs. In case you're not familiar, the top half of the league makes it. And the Kiwoom Heroes, they were the ones to squeak in there despite actually hovering around first or second for a good chunk of last season. A lot of moves here. What do we make of Addison Russell and Jake Brigham leaving this team?
Yeah, I think those are probably the second and third most significant departures. Losing Hassan Kim was arguably the biggest loss of anybody in the KBO. He's, of course, now a San Diego Padre and might now be a starting shortstop for a lot of the year, depending on what happens with Fernando Tatis's shoulder. So huge blow for the Heroes. He was one of the best Korean hitters in the league last season. But they didn't have the worst offseason because they do at least have a foreign hitter now. They had Taylor Motter with a disaster for just like a couple weeks at the start of the year. Brought in Addison Russell late, and he just didn't really move the needle at all. Jake Brigham did have a good season for them on the mound, but he was battling injury issues. And the fact that he's now in Taiwan rather than with another Korean team or perhaps a team in Japan probably says something about what his stock was this offseason. Josh Smith has at least, I think, parts of 5 years MLB experience, which puts him, I think, near the top of MLB experience for foreign arms. So there's maybe something there. And David Freitas is kind of a weird foreign hitter signing in that he's a catcher, but he's probably not going to catch much because Dongwon Park is one of the better catchers in the KBO. He hasn't been catching so far, I don't think. I think he's been just a designated hitter. So it's kind of weird to get a catcher and just use him for his bat, and his bat wasn't all that special in MLB, but can't be much worse than what they got out of that slot last year. I don't think he's going to make up for Hassan Kim, but it's something.
For sure. Hassan Kim definitely was the big move there. He actually had his average decrease from 2019 to 2020 by only 0.001. He still hit 306 last year, but actually had 30 home runs compared to 19 in 2019 with actually fewer games played. So definitely an impressive bat, and now filling in for Fernando Tatis Jr. On that San Diego Padres team here stateside. So definitely a big loss. Have to see how they bounce back. Moving on to the number 4 team, the Doosan Bears, who made some moves in the playoffs last year, going all the way in that format, going to the championship against the Dinos. Here we got Walker Lockett. He made his debut, going to fill that Raul Alcantara role because he was the best pitcher in October for the Bears and all of KBO.
Yeah, I think Alcantara and Chris Flexen was the best 1-2 punch, I believe, in the league. I guess you could say Chang Mo-Koo and Drew Wachinski for the Dinos were right up there. But Alcantara and Flexen were excellent. even if they get good numbers out of Walker Lockett and Ariel Miranda, which could well happen, it would be quite a surprise if they could match the strength of those two. So that's already, I think, a step down. And then you look at the free agents they lost as well, Jail O and Ji-Won Choi, who we talked about already. The Bears did manage to bring back a few pieces. They were set to lose a lot of guys in free agency with their very long dynasty sort of coming to an end. I think this is the worst offseason in the KBO, but they do still have enough talent left on that roster where if Lockett and Miranda are at least decent foreign arms, I think they're still a playoff team, but I don't think they're the contender that they've been for 5-6 years.
For sure, the 2019 KBO champs here, losing 2 aces for this offseason. Moving now to the number 3 team from last season, LG Twins, pretty quiet, swapping out Wilson for Andrew Suarez, who made an interesting debut yesterday, one of the only of starting pitcher among 22 with a scoreless debut, 6 innings, 1 hit, 2 walks against the KT Wiz. We'll get to the Wiz. Didn't have to face Mel Rojas Jr., but still, the Wiz were a dominant team last year, and he shut them down in his first start. We thinking he can replace Wilson in that rotation pretty well?
Yeah, Wilson had some really good seasons in the KBO, but was starting to battle some injury issues last year. Didn't finish with a great line. And the fact that I don't think he's found a new club yet, I think that indicates that teams probably weren't all that happy with his medicals. We'll see what we get out of Suarez, but Wilson's actual numbers last year won't be that hard to replace. It's generally a quiet offseason, but I think that's good for the Twins because they didn't lose Roberto Ramos, who was arguably the best foreign hitter in the league. Getting him back, or not arguably, I think that was Mel Rojas Jr., but arguably the second best. Not losing him, isn't a new signing, but the offseason could have gone a whole lot worse. And I think the fact that it didn't keeps them right up there as one of the top contenders.
Yeah, and speaking of the best foreign hitter in the KBO, the best hitter overall, we're looking at the number 2 KT Wiz from last year, Mel Rojas Jr. leaving for Japan. Almonte is going to be replacing him. I can't imagine this team is going to be anywhere near the same without Rojas. I mean, is that just a headline here?
He was a huge part of that lineup. They do have other talent. I mean, Jae-Gyun Hwang is a former major leaguer, former San Francisco Giant, and Baek-ho Gong is a future major leaguer if he continues on his trajectory. So they still have something in that lineup. Almonte has had some good seasons overseas, didn't do much on the MLB side. I don't think he's played in MLB since like 2014 or something. Huge shoes to fill. I don't think it's fair to think anybody's going to fill the void left by the MVP winner and near Triple Crown winner, Mel Rojas Jr. But if he's decent, they definitely have enough, I think, in the rest of the team to be one of the better teams again this year.
I like it. And, of course, the best team, the defending champs, the NC Dinos. Mike Wright leaving them for the White Sox, Wes Parsons replacing him in the rotation. What do we make of defending champs? Can they repeat here, Erik?
I think the biggest thing for the Dinos is the fact that Sungbum Na leaving is not on here because he was not able to find an MLB club. A little bit sad for him. I think the pandemic depressed market meant teams just weren't willing to commit early in the offseason to players they just didn't know that much about. And given the 30-day posting window, that made it tougher, I think, for him. Decent chance he makes a push again this next offseason if he does what he can do this year. So I think with him still on the team, with Yu Ji-young still on the team, and Aaron Altair still on the team, they've got the lineup to repeat. I don't think Mike Wright was anything special. I think he was an adequate enough foreign arm, but I don't think it should be too hard for Wes Parsons to replace him. Not that Wes Parsons had a particularly interesting MLB track record, but neither did Mike Wright. So I don't think that's necessarily a step back there. And the fact that they didn't take a step back elsewhere, I think leaves them as the favorites to repeat, if not necessarily an obvious clear cut above everybody else.
For sure. And they were my team last year, as Barry notes here. We'll see if we'll switch up. Don't want to announce a new team just quite yet, but we'll definitely keep the Dinos in mind as they had that very strong season last year and a decent offseason. They didn't need to do much since they did win it last season. Moving on now, I do want to talk briefly about DFS, kind of just 101 as a primer. We do have this article here by our very own Erik Halterman, by you, talking about the basics of daily fantasy. KBO and how that compares. And we want to go over that briefly now. We are talking about DraftKings. Erik, can you explain briefly the contest types? I believe they're all eligible now, but the main ones are tournaments and double-ups.
Yeah, tournaments and sort of the rest altogether. If anybody here is new to DFS and wants to give it a go, it's definitely fun in KBO because a whole lot of people don't necessarily know what they're doing. So if you know at all what you're doing, it can be a little bit more fun than some of the other games where you're competing with a ton of sharks. The main difference to know is that for a big tournament, you're going to have to take more risk. Bigger tournaments, usually only a small portion do finish in the prize money, but you get a big multiplier for your entry fee. So you got to get riskier, and you got to think more about stacking your players, stacking several guys from the same lineup. If there's a pitcher you think is pretty bad, send out 3 or 4 hitters against him. Because, again, you need several things to break your way to move to the top of a big pool. It's a lot easier for things to break your way if, your first baseman knocks in 2 of your outfielders with 1 hit. Suddenly that's a massive boost for you. Whereas in smaller tournaments, say a 50-50 or a double-up, those usually involve close to half of the player pool being in the money, but you return much less of your entry fee. Usually, you double your entry fee, something like that. So there you want to generally play it safer. You care less about other people having the same guy as you because all you have to do is beat the bottom half. So you take fewer risks there. Don't be afraid to use the obvious plays. Stacking is still good, but I think it's less important there.
And that might sound like a lot, but here on rotowire.com/free KBO, put the link here on the screen. We have some great tools to help you out with that. Going down here, the lineup optimizer, daily lineups, which we will go over, the injury report, and the cheat sheets. Erik, can you explain to us the lineup optimizer? What is that, and how can people use it?
Yeah, so it'll spit out a lineup for you. You can either just click it and see what happens, or you can play around with several parameters that you can investigate those more. Say, I definitely want this guy. I definitely don't want this guy. It'll give you estimates based on projections of who's a really good value today, who's a bad value. Those will often, I hope, agree with my cheat sheets, but not always. I think it's a good way to supplement that. I don't usually just play the optimizers lineup, but it is useful just as a second opinion. I use it, I think, more for brainstorming. It'll spit out a bunch of guys that you didn't necessarily think about, and you can go from there. Mix that with more subjective observations like you find if you read my cheat sheets.
I like it. And finally, we do have a couple tips here, for just fantasy baseball in general, but definitely important in the KBO nonetheless. What would you say is your top tip here?
Yeah, at bats matter a ton. I mean, if your guy comes to the plate 5 times instead of 4, that's 25% more chances to score points. So if you're up late enough that you can actually catch the KBO lineups, that can be difficult if you're in one of the North American time zones. But if you are, or those weekend lineups, I think usually come in at 1 p.m. ET, so you don't, or 1 a.m. So you don't have to be a crazy night owl. That might just be midnight, actually. I think they come out an hour before the games. So if you can catch the lineups, really scan for hitters who aren't usually at the top, because they'll often be priced as if they're somebody who hits in the bottom third of the order. Even if they're not all that good, again, they get an extra 25% plate appearances or something if they're hitting near the top of the order. And that can be a huge boost to their value, especially because they get to hit in front of better hitters. So if you get somebody with the platoon advantage against a shaky starter, hitting near the top of the order, even if they're not that good themselves, I think that's somebody you definitely want to think pretty hard about putting in your lineup, freeing up cap space to use on some of the studs that you'd look at regardless of their matchup or platoon advantage.
All right, so that's our quick DFS 101 primer. You can check out the full article by Erik on rotowire.com/free KBO. So moving now into what we'll be doing for the majority, for all of our shows here, going through each game by game. And we first begin with the Samsung Lions and Doosan Bears. I should note before we dive into that the weather looks to be very good. We have all that here on rotowire.com. So you can make sure you're not going to get a rain out. Not going to happen in the Kiwoom game, as that is in a dome. You see right there, that right there. So starting with that Lions-Bears game, we got Ariel Miranda making his KBO League debut tonight. That Bears lineup was powerful last year. You got Jose Fernandez batting second, and you got Jayhawk Kim, the solo shot last night. What are we looking at in this Lions-Bears matchup, Erik?
Yeah, I'd say the Bears probably lost their fifth and sixth best hitters over the offseason in Jail and Ju-Won Choi, who we talked about earlier. But they still got a very strong top four. Jose Fernandez, one of the best contact hitters in the league, can also get you 20 homers. Jayhawk Kim is one of the best Korean outfielders in the league. He's got power. And Kunwoo Park can do some of everything. Kyung Min Her is also one of the best contact hitters. I believe he had the lowest strikeout rate in the league. So those four, the top four, are really quite good. And they're interesting for daily fantasy against most matchups. And I think this is one of them. Hyun is fine, and he's young. He might get better eventually, but 4.89 ERA last year. He really doesn't strike people out, just 12.5% strikeout rate. The KBO strikeout rate is significantly lower than it is in MLB, but it was about 17.5% last year. So Juan was still significantly below that average walk rate. So really, he just relies on his fielders to do most of the work. That's classic number 4 or 5 starter kind of guy. Yet I guess this is their fourth game, so he does fit in well there. Really nothing special about him. Not terrible. We'll keep him in some games, but he's facing a good lineup here, and I think probably a better pitcher in Miranda.
One guy I wanted to mention, I want to get your thoughts on, was Jawwook Koo for the Lions. This guy hit 307 last year. He went 3 for 4 the other night with a 2-run home run. What are we thinking about Jawwook facing against Miranda?
Yeah, he's not somebody I'd want to do in DFS tonight because it's a lefty-on-lefty matchup, and it's a new foreign starter. But Koo is usually one of the Lions who's worth looking at. Not tonight, but he's usually not too expensive. He's hits for high average and does some power, some speed. One of their better hitters, but not quite in the league's upper echelon of bats, which is, of course, why the Lions have one of the weaker lineups in the league. And their lineup is propped up by their most hitter-friendly home park in the league, which has my favorite name, Daegu Samsung Lions Park. It's in Daegu, and the Samsung Lions play there. It's how we should probably name all our parks rather than whatever we're getting this year, Yeon Depot Park or something like that with a lowercase L. Not a fan of that one. We should follow the Lions formula, I think, for every stadium. But normally they get to be propped up by the most hitter-friendly park in the league. They're playing at the most pitcher-friendly park in this one, Jamsil Baseball Stadium, which makes that lineup, which is already pretty mediocre, a lot less intimidating.
All right, so what are we looking at picks? We're going to lean towards the Bears here with that new foreign starter on the bump.
Yeah, Miranda, he just pitched in Taiwan last year, which is a lower league than KBO. People usually say KBO is roughly AA-ish, and the CPBL in Taiwan is roughly A-ball. Those are pretty imprecise designations because the actual talent of any given player varies a ton, but Taiwan is definitely a lower level, and he had a 3.80 ERA there, which doesn't seem great, but Taiwan actually had a crazy offensive environment last year. So he was the 4th best ERA among pitchers who threw at least 100 innings. So he's, I think, at least pretty good. We'll get more of a sense on him later in the year, but I think he should be good enough to beat a pretty mediocre pitcher. So I think the Bears still have enough in their lineup to get this one done.
We're going with the Bears, and the total is set at 9.5. We're going to go over or under that?
I'm actually going to go under, and that's mostly thinking that Miranda is going to be pretty good. Would love to have a few more KBO starts or any KBO starts from him to have more confidence there. But when you got the very pitcher-friendly home park, you've got a Bears lineup that's worse than it used to be, and a Lions lineup that is never scary. I don't see a reason for this one to be particularly high-scoring.
All right, that's the Lions-Bears matchup. Moving on now, we have the Kia Tigers and the Heroes facing off. Erik, what are we looking at this matchup right here?
We are looking at a very bad pitcher on the Tigers side, or at least a very young and unproven pitcher. but he showed nothing last season. 4 starts, 11 relief appearances. He had an ERA over 7, a WHIP well over 2. He struck out just 11.5% of batters, and he walked more than 18.5%. So that's more than 50% more walks than strikeouts. So that the terrible ERA and WHIP very much deserved. Kind of a surprise to see that he's already in the starting rotation. I think that's a bad sign for the Tigers. Again, this is where they'd sure love to have Hyun Jung still on the team. But yeah, nothing close to good from Kim so far. So I would expect to see plenty of runs from the Heroes side, and I would definitely be stacking their lineup for daily fantasy.
And they are without Hassan Kim. We know he left to the Padres. Is there someone on that lineup you're targeting specifically for daily fantasy?
Well, Jung Lee is very capable of carrying a lineup. He's still young, I think 21, maybe just 22. He burst onto the scene hitting well over 300 as an 18-year-old rookie a few years ago, and he's done that every year since. In his 4th year last year, he had 15 homers, which is not a ton, but he only had 14 in the first 3 combined. So he's a guy who's always been an elite contact hitter, is adding a bit of power. I would not be at all surprised if he took another step forward in the power department this season, but even if he doesn't, he's already one of the best hitters in the league. So he's definitely could well be the most interesting hitter on tonight's daily fantasy slate. I like pretty much any Heroes hitter, though, given how shaky Kim seems to be. Jayhawk Lee, who I mentioned at the start of the show, he joined in free agency from the Eagles. He has no power. I think he's hit 2 homers in the last 3 years, but he makes good contact and his elite walk rate. So he's a great table setter. He's going to score a lot of runs for a Heroes lineup that isn't elite, but he's way better than the lineup he had last season as an Eagle. So I think he's a pretty interesting budget option in the outfield who should have a lot of fun hitting in front of guys like Jung-Hoo Lee and Byung-Ho Park, former major leaguer there too.
We are getting a comment here that Kim is in that not good Bell Pinto range. That's not a good sign, but it is a good sign that it could potentially go over on the total here. What are we thinking with this Tigers Heroes matchup set at 10.5 with the Heroes favored?
Yeah, very, very easy Heroes for me. I haven't talked about Josh Smith much. He's a new foreign import. We don't know exactly what he's going to look like at the KBO level. 5.60 ERA in parts of 5 MLB seasons is nothing special at all. But, that's a whole lot better than what Hyun-Soo Kim has shown at a lower level. So I think we should believe that Josh Smith is pretty good until he proves otherwise, as with all of these new foreign imports. The Tigers have some good bats, Preston Tucker and Hyung-Woo Choi in the middle of that order. This isn't necessarily the day that I would turn to them, although, again, we haven't seen Smith yet. So if you want to, I definitely don't hate it. They're a pair of excellent left-handed hitters. And I think they are enough that I'm comfortable going over here. I don't think this is one of those games where the Heroes have to hit all of it all by themselves. I think the Tigers have enough in their lineup where unless Smith is a revelation, which he could be, but unless he's excellent, I think he'll give up a few runs, and I think Hyun-Soo Kim is going to give up a ton before leaving early. I think those Heroes are just going to keep scoring off of the weak relievers for the Tigers too.
All right, that's what we're looking at with the Tigers-Heroes matchup going towards the Heroes and the over 10.5. Moving over to game 3. Well, the games are all at the same time, but number 3 we're talking about here is the LG Twins against the KT Wiz, 2 teams that made the playoffs last year, but did have some shakeups, at least with the Wiz, offensively. What do we think about this matchup?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most interesting game of the 5. Both pitchers are pretty interesting. Chan-Hyun Jung for the Twins. He moved back to the rotation last year for the first time since 2008. He had over a decade in relief. They were very careful with him. They were usually sending him down between starts. He only made 19 starts on the season, but it worked. So he had a 3.51 ERA, basically league average strikeout rate, didn't walk many guys, 6.5% walk rate. Not an elite starter, but a very solid mid-rotation arm. They'll have to probably keep managing him carefully this year, although I think in his second year back in the rotation, they might not have to be quite so careful. And then on the opposite side, we get something that we don't see on the MLB side at all. Jung Ko hasn't pitched in 2 years because he's been doing South Korea's mandatory military service. Guys have to do 2 years of military service. I believe it's unless they win an Olympic medal or maybe a Pan Asian Games medal too, something like that, where unless you do your national service on the sports field in some very notable capacity, you have to miss a couple seasons. I think Korea did medal a little while back, which is why a lot of the top guys in the league didn't have to do that because they were all on that team. But Ko, we haven't seen him in 2 years, so who knows what he's got to offer now. And his ERAs were above 5 when we last saw him, but there's still something there. I think that was the juice ball era for the KBO. They really deadened the ball in 2019 before going somewhat back to the middle last season. So 5 ERA in 2018 isn't quite as bad as it looks. And in his 2 seasons as a starter, despite those bad ERAs, he struck out 21% of opposing batters and walked just 3.3%. Both of those are excellent marks, or especially the walks. So who knows if he's still that guy, but if he is, I think if his batted ball luck is better this season, the Wiz might have basically conjured up a solid mid-rotation starter or even a number 2 out of pretty much nowhere. Probably has the highest spread of floor and ceiling of any starter in the league, as far as I can tell. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking picking a game involving him. His first game of the year, we haven't seen him back yet, but I think there's definitely a lot of intrigue there.
Yeah, a couple wild cards here in this game. We have the total set here at 10 here on the bottom, with the Twins slightly favored. What are we thinking about here? We're going to go with Young Ko, like you said, because of, I hope I'm saying that right, because of that high ceiling potential, because we kind of know what we have with Jung.
I think the expected outcome for Ko is still lower than what we saw from Hyun Jung last year. And I think that Twins lineup looks a little bit better than the Wiz now that the Wiz have replaced Mel Rojas Jr. with Zoilo Almonte, who incidentally, I think another switch hitter, the only switch hitter in the league still, I think. Rojas was the only guy with that label last year. So they have a type apparently. Until we see him do Mel Rojas Jr. things, we have to assume he's not Mel Rojas Jr., which means I think the Twins lineup with Hyun Kim, the good Hyun Kim, the former major leaguer Hyun Kim, not the Tigers pitcher who we just talked about. The Twins are pretty deep. That first 5 or so are all quite good. The Wiz have talent in the lineup too, but I think the Twins lineup is a bit deeper. I think it's better at the top with Ramos and Kim. And I like that we've at least seen Jung pitch recently. So I'm going to side the Twins, and I'm going to side under because I think there's enough there with both starters. But this is definitely the game I'll be paying most attention to, just to see what kind of Young Ko we see this year.
All right, we're going with the Twins, and the over-under is set at 10 runs. Where are we going here?
I'm going to go under. I like Jung, and I think Ko might have something. But again, he might be terrible because he hasn't pitched in 2 years, and this could be a blowout. So high variance game for sure, but 2 interesting pitchers.
For sure. Moving on now, we have the battle of the worst teams from last year, the Eagles and the Landers, formerly the Wyverns. If you missed our preview offseason breakdown from the beginning of the show, check that out. But we got Wilmer Font, the newest member of the Landers. Where are we going here with these 2 teams that were not good last season?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I think the Landers had the best offseason in the league outside of their branding decisions. So I'm not necessarily thinking of them as basically the Eagles this season. I think with Shin-Soo Choo, even though he hasn't done anything in 2 games, that's just 2 games. Jamie Romack is quite good slugger. And Jung Cha is one of the best hitters in KBO history. He's second all-time on the KBO home run leaderboard. And Ju-Won Choi gives them a top 5 that's pretty good. Still some questions about their pitching depth, but on a day where they get one of their 2 new foreign starters in, I think they should look like a pretty strong team. Wilmer Font was a pretty interesting pitcher a few years ago. At the AAA level, he had elite strikeout and walk numbers in 2017, a 32% strikeout rate and a walk rate of just 6.3%. But he was old for the level, and it just didn't translate in MLB. He's been nothing special, 5.82 ERA. Although he does have close to a league average strikeout and walk rates at the MLB level. So I think he's one of the more interesting new foreign starters to me. I think he has a chance of being quite good. But he doesn't even have to be very good at all to silence an Eagles lineup that was already bad, and they lost their leadoff man in Jung Lee. Ryan Healy might be something, but there's just not a lot else there. I hardly ever recommend any of their other hitters for DFS reasons, and I wouldn't be recommending any of them today against Font.
Remember when the Eagles had Brandon Barnes? The good old days when they were really, really bad at losing streak. Got to imagine you're going against Eagles here, even with the upgrade at Healy at the 4 and bat.
Yeah, not nearly enough there. Very, very easy landers for me. And I think it's over, even though I like Wilmer Font. We haven't touched on Hyun Kim yet. Probably even worse, maybe, than Hyun Kim. It's close. He at least threw over 60 innings last season and was just nowhere close to good. 6.82 ERA, 184 WHIP. He also walked more guys than he struck out. That was the second worst ERA among pitchers who threw at least 60 innings and the worst WHIP. So he was the worst pitcher, I think, who got regular opportunities last season. He also walked more guys than he struck out in 2019. So he's young, but he's shown nothing ever. Also, you might notice his name used to be E1 Kim with 2 E's. I think we changed up some of the spellings of our names on here, but I think DraftKings did as well. Obviously, the transliterations of Korean names can vary between sites. I think you can see guys with 7 different spellings, but keep an eye out for a few of those early in the season. Usually, phonetically, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out. So I think with Kim being one of the shakiest pitchers out there with an improved Landers lineup, I think they're going to do enough to hit that over, even though I do like Font and like just about nothing on the Eagles' offensive side.
And finally, we go to our last game here. We have the defending champs, the Dinos, taking on the Lotte Giants. What are we looking at here, Erik?
Yeah, slow start for the Dinos this year. They lost their first 2. I would not be all that worried yet, although they are without Cheng Mo-ku for the early part of the season with, I think it was another arm issue, which is not a good sign at all. Jayhawk Lee was quite good in 2019. Had an ERA of 3.75, but he was awful last season. 6.55 ERA, 163 WHIP. He struck out about 15% and walked 10.5%. Gave up 1.4 homers per 9 innings. Just bad in just about every way you could be bad. And he's now 30, so there's not really hope of a massive bounce back. Although, again, he has shown something in the past. Maybe 5-6 starts into the year, if he looks like that 2019 version of himself, I'll be somewhat interested. But he was very much a 5th starter, if even that, last year. So I think that this definitely gives the Giants a chance in this one, despite the fact that the Dinos should have a significantly better lineup.
And on that Giants side, is anything there threatening in terms of against Lee?
Yeah, I like Asapsan is one of the best contact hitters in the league. He'll get the platoon advantage against Lee. Daiho Lee won't get the platoon advantage, but he usually comes fairly cheap at a very deep and expensive first base position. So they got a few decent hitters. They're just a unique team in that they chose to spend their foreign hitter slot on a defense-first player in Dixon Machado, who usually bats in the bottom third of the order. He was a fine hitter, but he's there mostly for his glove, and he did get hit by a pitch yesterday, so who knows if he's even playing today. Although, again, not a massive loss for them offensively, much more of a defensive loss. So not a big lineup there, not a terrible one, though. So they definitely have a chance to score some runs off a pitcher who's shaky like Jayhawk Lee.
And that is our last game here. The over-under set at 11. with the Dinos as the heavy favorite. Where are we going here?
11 is high, but with Lee being so shaky and with the Dinos lineup supposed to be pretty good, even if they've gotten off to a slow start as a team, I don't think Sewung Park is all that scary on the Giants side. I think he's fine, but 4.70 ERA last year, whip of 1.5, slightly below average strikeouts, but decent control. He's a fine 3-4 starter. I think he's better than Jayhawk Lee, but I think the Dinos lineup is enough better than the Giants that I'm going to lean slightly Dinos here. But again, if you want to go with the upset based on Jayhawk Lee's struggles, I don't think that's at all crazy.
And that over 11 runs, are we confident that we're going to have the Dinos lineup explode like we saw many times last year?
It's a high one, but I think it's decent. I think I'm going to go over. I just think they're too good to be held down by a mediocre pitcher like Sewung Park, and I think Jayhawk Lee can give up runs to anybody. So it's high for a reason, but I still think it's a decent pick there.
Yes, and it's not showing up here, but we did have this game, so check out the chat for that one. That is all 5 games here. Erik, what would you say is your number one pick? What are you feeling as your number one, and then also top 3 if you want to give us a little more flexibility?
I think definitely Heroes over Tigers. I mean, we don't know what Josh Smith's going to be, but we have to assume that all foreign starters are not Ricardo Pinto until they prove that they are Ricardo Pinto. And Hyun Kim was nowhere close to good last season. Heroes have a slightly better lineup anyway, so I think that's a pretty big margin there. I think that one's number 1. Although I guess the Landers over the Eagles is not that far behind. Kind of weird to say that for the second worst team in the league last year, but I do think they got a lot better. I don't know if they're necessarily a playoff team, but I think they're probably going to finish in the 5 to 7 range this year, not the 8 to 10 range. They've got a new foreign starter, one who's pretty interesting to me, and they're going against the other very, very shaky pitcher, and the Eagles just have nothing offensively. So I think pretty easy Landers on that one. Then it is a step down for the third pick, but for the third pick, I will go Bears over Lions. Hyun is fine, but Ariel Miranda, again, going with the rule of these new foreign starters we should assume are pretty good, and he has had success overseas already. Again, was better than he looks if you look at his numbers in Taiwan, because that league is very much an offensive environment. So I think I'm expecting him to be at least pretty good, and the Bears lineup is significantly better than the Lions, even with a couple losses. So I think they're number 3 for me.
And that's our top 3 picks here. We have put these in the chat here. We got the Heroes, we got the Landers. Take a little time to get used to that, not the Wyverns, and then the Bears. Going with those as the top 3. And that is all we have for today's show. In case you missed any of it, we did cover some DFS 101, the offseason recap. These teams had a little action from last season. The Landers having the best one, in Erik's opinion. But we'll see how that happens and how that all takes place tonight. Thank you guys for joining us. We keep an eye out on Twitter at RotoWire KBO for our show on a consistent time, most likely Mondays coming at you. So thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. It's good to be back.